The arrival. The soft hum of high-end vehicles echoed through the underground parking garage as Dr. Amara Daniels stepped out of her sleek black luxury car. A towering figure of elegance and poise, she adjusted the cuffs of her tailored navy blue suit, her signature heels clicking against the concrete as she approached the elevator. The briefcase in her hand held the contracts for her next major acquisition, a deal that would cement her status as one of the most influential CEOs in the world. Amara wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a symbol of resilience. Rising from humble beginnings, she built her empire brick by brick, defying every odd stacked against her. Today, she was heading to a business summit in New York, where she was scheduled to deliver the keynote address. Her private jet, a symbol of her relentless drive, awaited her. As she reached the terminal, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her assistant, Lori. Lori, everything is ready. Have a safe flight. Dr. Daniels. Let me know if you need anything before takeoff. Amara smiled, typing a quick response before slipping the phone into her coat pocket. Entering the private terminal, she paused to admire the calm and polished environment. Marble floors gleaming under soft lighting, artwork lining the walls, and an air of exclusivity that reflected her journey. However, as she approached the gate leading to her jet, a shadow of unease crept into her usually steady demeanor. A uniformed man, tall and imposing, stood with his arms crossed in front of the jet's entrance. His sharp features and scrutinizing gaze locked onto her as she drew closer. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone clipped and professional, but laced with skepticism. Amara raised an eyebrow, her polished demeanor unshaken. "I'm here for the flight to New York," she replied, her voice calm yet authoritative. The man, whose name tag read Captain Jason Caldwell, gave her a once-over, his expression tightening. "This is a private jet," he said, emphasizing the word private as though she had wandered into the wrong place. Amara's grip on her briefcase tightened. She had faced this kind of judgment before, people assuming that her success was a mistake, a fluke, or outright impossible. The weight of stereotypes pressed heavily on her chest, but she wasn't here to make apologies or explain herself. "Yes, I'm aware," she said, her tone cool and measured. "This is my jet." Captain Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly, his smirk betraying a hint of disbelief. "Your jet, ma'am," he repeated, as if confirming what he had heard. "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" Before Amara could respond, a flight attendant named Jessica approached. She held a tablet in one hand and smiled politely, though her demeanor shifted slightly as she glanced at Amara. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Jessica asked. "I was just confirming if this lady is supposed to be on this flight," Caldwell said, his tone condescending. "She claims it's her jet." Amara met Jessica's gaze, her eyes steady and unwavering. "There's no need for claims," she said. "I have the confirmation right here." She retrieved her phone, pulling up the email from her assistant, and handed it over to Jessica without another word. Jessica's confidence faltered as she scanned the email. Her face flushed slightly as she looked back at Amara, now clearly aware of her error. "Everything checks out," she said softly, handing the phone back to her. "Apologies for the misunderstanding." Amara nodded, not bothering to hide her disappointment. "Thank you," she said curtly, stepping past both Jessica and Caldwell to board the plane. As she entered the cabin, she took a moment to appreciate the space she had designed to be her sanctuary in the skies. Cream-colored leather seats, handcrafted wood accents, and the faint aroma of lavender filled the air. Normally, she would feel a swell of pride knowing how far she had come, but today, the weight of the interaction lingered heavily. She settled into her seat, gazing out the window as the city skyline stretched toward the horizon. Her heart simmered with a quiet resolve. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But today, something was different. Today, she wouldn't let the slight pass unaddressed. Amara tapped her fingers against the armrest, her mind racing with possibilities. She wasn't one for grand displays or dramatic confrontations, but she had built her empire by making statements that were impossible to ignore. The question wasn't whether she would respond. It was how. The unseen storm. The jet's engines hummed softly as Dr. Amara Daniels settled into her custom-designed leather seat. Despite the luxurious surroundings, the sleek interior, the ambient lighting, the quiet hum of efficiency, she couldn't shake the memory of Captain Caldwell's condescending tone or the wary glance from Jessica. It wasn't the first time Amara had been underestimated, but the moment lingered like a shadow over the cabin's warm glow. She glanced out the window, watching the ground crew prepare the jet for departure. Her mind, usually sharp and focused, replayed the encounter at the terminal. She had built her career on precision, on controlling every aspect of her professional life, but moments like these reminded her that no amount of success could shield her from the assumptions people made based on her appearance. The thought simmered in her mind as the jet began taxiing toward the runway. Amara reached for her laptop and opened her calendar. She had a busy itinerary waiting for her in New York. Meetings with investors, interviews with major media outlets, and, of course, her keynote address at the summit. The summit's theme: _breaking barriers. Redefining leadership for a new era. Felt personal. It wasn't just about her professional accomplishments. It was about the countless times she had to fight for her right to stand in rooms others assumed she didn't belong in. Her assistant, Lori, had prepared a draft of the keynote speech, but as Amara read through it, she felt an idea forming, a pivot that felt more urgent and authentic in light of the morning's events. She started typing furiously, her thoughts flowing onto the page like a dam breaking loose. The words were raw, powerful, and unapologetic, weaving her personal experiences with the broader struggles faced by those who defied stereotypes and broke barriers. Her concentration was broken by the soft knock on the cabin door. Jessica, the flight attendant, entered hesitantly, carrying a tray with a steaming cup of coffee and a small plate of pastries. "Dr. Daniels," she began, her tone polite but tinged with unease, "your refreshments." Amara looked up, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said, her voice neutral. Jessica lingered for a moment as if wanting to say something but unsure how to proceed. "About earlier," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to apologize if there was any misunderstanding." Amara met her gaze, her expression softening slightly but remaining firm. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," she replied, her tone measured. "It was an assumption." Jessica's cheeks flushed. "I didn't mean—" "I know," Amara interrupted gently but firmly. "And that's part of the problem, isn't it? You didn't mean it, but it still happened." Jessica looked down, clearly uncomfortable but also introspective. "I'm sorry," she repeated. "It won't happen again." Amara nodded, letting the silence stretch for a moment before replying. "Apologies are a start. Awareness is better. Action is best." Jessica nodded, her posture shifting from defensive to reflective. "Thank you," she said before quietly leaving the cabin. Amara sipped her coffee, letting the warm liquid soothe her frustration. She wasn't angry with Jessica, not really. The young woman was a product of the same system that had underestimated Amara her entire life. But Captain Caldwell's behavior was a different matter. His authority and attitude represented an entrenched bias that wouldn't be so easily dismantled. The flight was smooth, the jet cutting through clouds like a needle through silk. Amara closed her laptop after finalizing her keynote and leaned back in her seat, allowing herself a rare moment of rest. She glanced at the small screen embedded in the seatback in front of her and decided to review the weather conditions in New York. The forecast was clear, with bright skies predicted for her arrival. It felt symbolic, as if the universe was promising her a clean slate. As the flight neared its destination, Jessica returned to the cabin, looking more composed. "Dr. Daniels, Captain Caldwell would like to extend his apologies as well. He said he'd like to speak with you personally if you're open to it." Amara raised an eyebrow, intrigued but skeptical. Did he now? Yes, Mom, Jessica said, fidgeting slightly. He said he wanted to clarify any misunderstandings. Amara considered this for a moment before nodding. Tell him I'll meet him after we land. The jet touched down at the private airstrip in New York, and the cabin door opened to reveal a crisp winter breeze. Amara gathered her things, adjusting her coat and picking up her briefcase. As she stepped off the jet, Captain Caldwell was waiting near the tarmac, his posture stiff, but his expression less guarded than before. Dr. Daniels, he began, his voice lacking the condescension it carried earlier. I wanted to apologize for my behavior back at the terminal. Amara stood tall, her presence commanding yet composed. I'm listening. Caldwell hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. I made an assumption that I shouldn't have. It was unprofessional and, frankly, disrespectful. I misjudged you, and I'm sorry. Amara studied him for a moment, her silence forcing him to sit with his discomfort. Finally, she spoke. Do you understand why your assumption was problematic? Yes, he replied, though his voice wavered slightly. It was wrong of me to judge you based on appearances. I've learned a lesson today. Amara's expression softened, though her gaze remained sharp. Captain Caldwell, lessons only matter if they lead to change. I hope this experience will make you question your biases in the future. He nodded, his demeanor earnest. It will, Dr. Daniels. Amara inclined her head, accepting his apology without offering absolution. Good. Let's make sure this doesn't happen again, not just with me but with anyone. As she walked toward the waiting car that would take her to the summit, Amara felt a sense of resolve. She couldn't change the world overnight, but she could make an impact, one interaction at a time. And with her keynote just hours away, she knew exactly how she was going to channel this moment into something powerful and transformative. The unseen storm inside her had passed, but the winds of change were just beginning to stir. Amara's car, a sleek black sedan, waited at the edge of the tarmac, the driver standing by with the door open. Before stepping in, she turned back to glance at the jet. The interaction with Captain Caldwell replayed in her mind, not as a source of anger, but as a moment of clarity. This wasn't just about her experience. It was about what it represented. If someone as visible and successful as her could be underestimated so openly, what must others, without her platform, endure every day? This thought ignited a fire within her. Amara had spent years overcoming barriers, but now it was time to dismantle the structures that upheld them. Inside the car, she placed her briefcase beside her and pulled out her phone. She opened her notes app and began to refine her speech further, drawing directly from the morning's events. Her words needed to be more than inspirational. They had to be actionable. She wanted her audience to feel the urgency of change, not just the comfort of shared frustration. As the city skyline came into view, Amara's focus was interrupted by a call from Lori, her assistant. Dr. Daniels, Lori began, her tone warm and professional. I just wanted to confirm your schedule for the afternoon. You're set to arrive at the hotel in about 30 minutes. The press briefing is at 2 p.m., and the keynote is at 5. Thank you, Lori, Amara replied. Can you also reach out to the summit organizers? I want to make sure there's time for an open Q&A after my keynote. I think it's important for the audience to engage directly. Of course, Lori said, typing notes audibly in the background. Anything else? Amara paused, thinking. Yes. After the summit, let's arrange for a discussion panel on implicit bias in leadership. I want this conversation to extend beyond just a speech. Understood, Lori replied. I'll start coordinating right away. Hanging up, Amara stared out of the window at the bustling streets of New York. The city's energy was infectious, a constant reminder of the hustle that had brought her to this point. But today, it also reminded her of the disparities that still existed, even in spaces that prided themselves on progressiveness. At the hotel, Amara was greeted with the kind of treatment she had come to expect. A red carpet welcome, staff eagerly assisting her with her belongings, and the concierge addressing her with genuine respect. It was a stark contrast to her morning at the terminal. As she entered her suite, she took a moment to collect herself. The room was spacious and tastefully decorated, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. On the desk, a handwritten note from the summit organizers welcomed her and thanked her for her participation. Beside it was a gift basket filled with gourmet treats and a bottle of champagne. Amara appreciated the gesture, but barely glanced at it. She set her briefcase down and returned to her laptop. There was more work to be done, and her speech was evolving with every passing moment. By 2 p.m., she was seated in the conference room for the press briefing. Journalists from major media outlets filled the room, cameras flashing as she entered. Amara had become a familiar face in the business world, and her story, rising from modest beginnings to running a multi-billion-dollar empire, was nothing short of inspirational. After a brief introduction by the moderator, questions began pouring in. "Dr. Daniels," one reporter asked, "what advice would you give to young women of color aspiring to reach the heights you've achieved?" Amara smiled, her tone thoughtful. "The first thing I'd say is to embrace your uniqueness. The world will try to box you into categories, but your strength lies in breaking out of them. Surround yourself with people who believe in your vision, and never let anyone define your worth." Another reporter chimed in. "You've often spoken about the challenges of navigating systemic bias in corporate America. Can you share a recent example of how you've addressed such challenges?" Amara paused, her expression calm but resolute. She hadn't planned to share the morning's incident publicly, but now felt like the perfect moment to illustrate the pervasive nature of the issue. "This morning," she began, "as I arrived at the terminal for my private jet, I was met with skepticism. Despite being the owner of the jet, I was questioned about whether I was supposed to be there. It wasn't an overt act of hostility, but the assumption underlying it speaks volumes about the biases that still exist." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the audience. "But let me be clear," she continued. "These moments are not just opportunities for frustration. They're opportunities for education. I addressed the situation directly and used it as a moment to challenge those assumptions. We can't change what we don't confront." The reporters scribbled furiously, some nodding in agreement. Amara's voice carried a sense of conviction that made it impossible to ignore her message. As the briefing concluded, Amara returned to her suite for a brief respite before her keynote. She stood by the window, gazing out at the city once more. The sun was beginning to dip, casting a golden hue over the skyscrapers. She thought about the captain, the flight attendant, the countless individuals she had encountered who underestimated her. Their assumptions had never stopped her, but today she realized they had shaped her journey in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged. They had fueled her drive to excel, to defy, to prove them wrong, not for their sake, but for her own, and for those who would follow. Amara turned away from the window, a renewed sense of purpose coursing through her. She didn't just want to succeed. She wanted to leave a legacy that ensured the next generation wouldn't have to face the same battles she did. Tonight's keynote wasn't just another speech. It was a declaration, a call to action, and the beginning of something bigger. And she was ready. The keynote that changed everything. The grand ballroom of the summit venue was a masterpiece of modern elegance. Crystal chandeliers hung like suspended stars, casting a warm glow over the room. Rows of meticulously arranged chairs stretched toward a stage adorned with a minimalist podium and a massive LED screen displaying the event's theme. Breaking barriers, redefining leadership for a new era. The space buzzed with anticipation. Executives, thought leaders, and aspiring entrepreneurs filled the seats, their conversations blending into a low hum of excitement. They had come to hear from one of the most dynamic voices in modern business, Dr. Amara Daniels. Backstage, Amara adjusted the lapel of her tailored blazer, her face calm but focused. Lori, her assistant, stood nearby, reviewing last-minute details on her tablet. "Everything's set," Lori said, her voice steady. "You're up in 5 minutes." Amara nodded, her fingers lightly grazing the edges of the note cards in her hand. She had prepared for this moment meticulously, but the events of the day had added a layer of urgency to her words. This was no longer just a speech, it was a statement. A technician approached, fitting her with a discreet microphone. "Dr. Daniels, you'll step onto the stage as soon as the moderator introduces you," he explained. "Thank you," she said, offering a small smile. The moderator's voice echoed through the ballroom, silencing the murmurs of the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute honor to introduce a trailblazer in every sense of the word. Dr. Amara Daniels has redefined what it means to lead, innovate, and inspire. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage." A thunderous applause erupted as Amara stepped into the spotlight. Her presence was commanding yet graceful, her stride deliberate. She took her place behind the podium, scanning the audience with a gaze that seemed to connect with every individual in the room. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady and warm. "It's a privilege to stand before you today, especially under the theme of breaking barriers. Because, in many ways, breaking barriers has defined my life, not just as a professional, but as a human being." The audience leaned in, captivated by her opening. Amara took a brief pause, letting the weight of her words settle before continuing. "When we talk about leadership," she said, "we often focus on vision, strategy, and execution. But there's another layer, one that's rarely discussed, but deeply felt. It's the silent struggle of proving you deserve to be in the room, even when you've earned your place 10 times over." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Amara's voice grew more impassioned as she recounted stories from her journey, moments of triumph, moments of doubt, and moments of sheer resilience. But then she shifted gears. "This morning," she said, her tone quiet but firm, "I was reminded of why conversations like this are so important. As I prepared to board my private jet, I was stopped and questioned, not because there was a valid concern, but because of an assumption rooted in bias." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her. Amara paused, allowing the tension to build before continuing. "Now let me be clear," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "This isn't about that one moment or the people involved. It's about what that moment represents. It's about the systems and mindsets that allow such assumptions to persist, even in spaces that claim to champion progress and inclusivity." Her words struck a chord, and the audience shifted in their seats, visibly reflecting on the weight of her message. Amara went on to weave the incident into a broader narrative about systemic bias and the responsibility of leaders to challenge it. She spoke of the need for accountability, not just in overt acts of discrimination, but in the subtler, more insidious ways it manifests. "Leadership," she said, her voice rising with conviction, "is not just about driving results. It's about creating spaces where everyone is seen, valued, and respected. It's about recognizing the barriers that exist and committing to tearing them down, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us." The audience erupted into applause, a standing ovation sweeping through the room. But Amara wasn't done. She raised a hand, signaling for silence. "Applause is easy," she said, her tone serious but not unkind. "Action is harder. So let me challenge you, not as a CEO, but as a fellow human being. When you leave here today, ask yourself, what assumptions am I making? What barriers am I perpetuating, even unconsciously? And most importantly, what can I do to change that?" The room fell silent again, the gravity of her challenge sinking in. Amara's words had turned the keynote into something more, a call to action that resonated deeply with everyone present. As she concluded her speech, Amara's final words left an indelible mark. "Breaking barriers isn't a one-time act," she said. "It's a lifelong commitment. And if we all make that commitment, together, we can redefine what leadership and humanity truly mean." The applause this time was deafening, filled with an energy that transcended admiration. It was the kind of applause that signaled not just agreement, but a readiness to act. Amara stepped off the stage, her heart racing, but her expression calm. She knew the real work was only beginning, but for now, she had done what she came to do: ignite a spark. And judging by the intensity of the crowd's reaction, that spark had caught fire. As she exited backstage, Lori was waiting, her eyes shining with pride. "That was incredible," she said. "I think you just changed the game." Amara smiled, her mind already racing with plans for what came next. "Good," she replied. "Now let's make sure the momentum doesn't stop here." The unseen storm she had felt earlier that day was now a powerful wind, carrying her message far beyond the walls of that ballroom. And for Amara, that was only the beginning. The ripple effect. As Dr. Amara Daniels stepped off the stage, the weight of her words lingered in the air. She had delivered many speeches in her career, but this one felt different. Sharper, more urgent. Her keynote hadn't just been a recounting of her journey. It was a challenge, a dare to those listening to confront their own biases and take action. The conference staff ushered her backstage, where a small group of reporters and photographers were waiting for a post-keynote interview. Lori, her ever-efficient assistant, was already coordinating, making sure the process flowed seamlessly. Dr. Daniels, a young journalist, began, his voice tinged with both nervousness and admiration. "Your keynote was deeply impactful. What inspired you to speak so candidly about the challenges of implicit bias, especially as someone who has achieved so much success?" Amara took a moment to compose her response. "Success doesn't make you immune to bias," she said, her voice steady. "If anything, it magnifies the moments when you're underestimated or misjudged. I spoke candidly today because I believe we can't fix what we refuse to acknowledge. Change starts with honesty, and honesty requires courage." The journalist nodded, scribbling furiously in his notebook. Another reporter raised her hand. "You mentioned an incident this morning at the terminal. Do you think such experiences are common for leaders of color, even at your level?" Amara's expression turned serious. "Absolutely," she replied. "Bias doesn't check your title, your income, or your accomplishments. It's pervasive. What matters is how we respond to it. We have a responsibility, especially as leaders, to challenge those biases, not just for ourselves, but for the people who look up to us." The interview continued, with questions delving deeper into Amara's perspective on leadership, equity, and the systemic barriers that persist in modern workplaces. By the time it ended, Amara could feel the shift in the room. This wasn't just another press event. It was the beginning of a conversation that demanded action. As the evening progressed, Amara found herself navigating the networking portion of the summit. Attendees, ranging from ambitious young entrepreneurs to seasoned executives, approached her with questions, praise, and, occasionally, confessions of their own blind spots. One young woman, her eyes shining with determination, introduced herself as Elena, the founder of a tech startup. "Dr. Daniels," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "your keynote hit me hard. I've always been the only woman of color in the room, and I thought I just had to endure it. But listening to you made me realize I don't have to accept that. It's something I can fight to change." Amara placed a reassuring hand on Elena's shoulder. "You're absolutely right," she said. "Endurance is admirable, but transformation is powerful. Use your voice, your platform, and your perspective to challenge the status quo. That's how real change happens." Elena nodded, her confidence bolstered by Amara's words. As she walked away, Amara couldn't help but smile. These were the moments she cherished, seeing the spark of potential ignited in others. Not everyone, however, was as open to her message. Later in the evening, Amara found herself in a conversation with a group of older executives. One of them, a graying man named Charles, had a skeptical expression. "I have to admit," Charles said, swirling the whiskey in his glass, "I'm not sure I agree with everything you said earlier. This focus on implicit bias, it feels like we're making a big deal out of something that's always been there. People succeed when they're good enough, regardless of obstacles." Amara's gaze didn't waver. "Charles," she said, her tone calm but firm, It's precisely because those obstacles have always been there that we need to address them. Just because something has been normalized doesn't make it acceptable. Good leadership is about recognizing what's broken and taking responsibility for fixing it. The surrounding executives murmured, some nodding in agreement. Charles seemed taken aback, but didn't argue further. Amara wasn't trying to win him over completely. Her goal was to plant the seed of doubt, to make him question his assumptions. As the evening wound down, Amara returned to her suite, exhausted but exhilarated. The day had been a whirlwind of emotions, from the tension at the terminal to the triumph of her keynote. She sank into the plush armchair by the window, the city lights twinkling like stars below. Her phone buzzed on the side table. It was a message from Lori. "Lori, you're trending on social media. People are calling your keynote a game changer. Check the hashtag Breaking Barriers tag when you have a chance." Amara opened her social media app and was immediately struck by the flood of posts. Clips from her speech had gone viral, with captions like, "This is the leadership we need," and "Dr. Daniels just redefined breaking barriers." But what touched her most were the personal stories people were sharing. One post read, "After hearing Dr. Daniels speak, I confronted my team about an issue I'd been ignoring for months. It's time to do better." Another said, "As a young black woman in tech, I needed to hear this. Thank you, Dr. Daniels, for reminding me I belong." Amara felt a lump form in her throat. This was why she did what she did. Not for the applause or the accolades, but for the ripple effect, seeing her words inspire others to take action in their own lives. As she prepared for bed, Amara's mind buzzed with ideas. She would build on this momentum, creating initiatives that extended beyond speeches and summits, workshops on leadership and bias, mentorship programs for underrepresented groups, partnerships with organizations committed to equity. There was so much she could do. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The day had started with a challenge, but it had ended with a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had been inspired by her message. As she turned off the lights, the city continued to shine outside, a constant reminder of the possibilities that lay ahead. Amara closed her eyes, her resolve stronger than ever. The ripple effect had begun, and she was ready to ride the waves it created. The next morning, sunlight poured into Amara's suite, casting golden streaks across the room. She woke up earlier than usual, her mind already buzzing with thoughts about the day ahead. Today wasn't just about meetings and follow-ups. It was about capitalizing on the momentum her keynote had generated. Amara's morning began with a strong coffee and a quick scan of her email inbox. It was flooded with messages, ranging from invitations to speak at future events to heartfelt notes from attendees who had been moved by her speech. One email caught her eye, a message from a young man named Derek, who had been in the audience the previous evening. Subject: "Thank you for giving me courage. Dear Dr. Daniels, I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I felt I had to write. I'm Derek, a mid-level manager at a tech company, and last night, you said something that really hit me. Action is harder. It made me realize how often I've stayed silent when I've seen biases at play in my workplace. I stayed late after the summit and wrote a proposal for our leadership team, a plan to create mentorship opportunities for underrepresented employees and revise our hiring practices to be more inclusive. I don't know if they'll approve it, but for the first time, I'm willing to try. Thank you for showing me that leadership isn't about waiting for permission. Sincerely, Derek." Amara leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing on her lips. Derek's email was a reminder that change didn't always start with sweeping reforms. Sometimes it began with one person deciding to act. Later that morning, Amara joined Lori in the conference center's private lounge. Lori was juggling a tablet and a cup of tea, her usual calm demeanor slightly frazzled. "You've been requested for 3 impromptu meetings today," Lori said, scrolling through her notes. 2 are with summit organizers. They want to discuss expanding next year's event to focus more on equity and inclusion. The 3rd is with a group of venture capitalists who were moved by your speech. They're interested in funding startups led by underrepresented founders. Amara raised an eyebrow. That's unexpected. They said your keynote inspired them, Lori added, her tone carrying a hint of pride. I told them you'd consider it. Amara chuckled. Good call. Let's set up the meetings, but keep them short. I still want to spend time with some of the younger entrepreneurs here. Lori nodded, already typing away. Got it. The first meeting of the day was with the summit organizers, a mix of executives and event planners. They had been blown away by the feedback from Amara's speech and wanted her input on how to make next year's summit even more impactful. We've received dozens of suggestions from attendees, one organizer said, sliding a folder across the table. A lot of them mention you by name. They're asking for panels, workshops, even a dedicated track on breaking barriers in leadership. Amara opened the folder, scanning the notes and suggestions inside. This is incredible, she said, but if we're going to do this, we need to approach it with intention. It can't just be a discussion, it needs to lead to action. Let's build partnerships with organizations already working in these spaces and bring in voices from outside the corporate world. The organizers nodded, taking notes furiously. Amara's vision was clear. The summit shouldn't just inspire. It should equip attendees with the tools to make real, tangible changes. Her next meeting was with the venture capitalists, a group of older men and women who had built their wealth through decades of investments. They seemed eager, almost impatient, as Amara entered the room. Dr. Daniels, one of them said, rising to shake her hand, we were deeply moved by your keynote. It made us realize how narrow our focus has been in funding. We've missed opportunities to back some truly innovative ideas simply because we weren't looking in the right places. Amara nodded, taking a seat at the head of the table. Awareness is the first step, she said. But what matters is what you do next. How do you plan to address this gap? The group exchanged glances before one of them spoke up. We want to establish a fund specifically for startups led by women and people of color. We believe your insights could help shape its direction. Amara's expression remained thoughtful, even as a sense of satisfaction stirred within her. If you're serious about this, she said, it needs to be more than a PR move. It needs to be a long-term commitment with measurable outcomes. Are you ready for that? They nodded, and by the end of the meeting, Amara had agreed to consult on the fund's development. It was a step in the right direction, but she knew the real work was just beginning. By the afternoon, Amara found herself in a breakout session with a group of young entrepreneurs. Unlike the polished professionals at the main event, these individuals exuded raw energy and ambition. Their ideas were bold, their passion contagious. One young man named Caleb spoke about his app designed to connect low-income communities with job opportunities. The biggest challenge, he admitted, is getting investors to take me seriously. They look at me, and all they see is where I come from, not what I can do. Amara leaned forward, her tone encouraging but firm. Caleb, let me tell you something. People's perceptions are their limitation, not yours. If they can't see your value, find someone who will. And until then, keep refining your pitch, your product, and your purpose. When you're undeniable, they won't have a choice but to take notice. The room erupted into applause, and Caleb beamed. Moments like these reminded Amara of why she loved connecting with emerging leaders. They were the future, and she was determined to pave the way for them. As the day wound down, Amara returned to her suite, her heart full. The ripple effect of her keynote was already unfolding in ways she hadn't anticipated. People were talking, planning, and most importantly, acting. She sat by the window once again, the city glowing beneath her. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Jessica, a flight attendant from her private jet. Jessica, Dr. Daniels, I just wanted to say thank you. After our conversation, I started thinking about my own biases and how they show up in my work. I've enrolled in a diversity training program, and I'm committed to doing better. Thank you for helping me see what I couldn't before. Amara smiled, her resolve solidifying. The ripple effect wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who chose to take that first step toward change. And as far as she was concerned, this was only the beginning. The crossroads of legacy. The next day began early for Dr. Amara Daniels, with her calendar packed full of follow-ups, interviews, and a special invitation to a closed-door roundtable discussion with influential leaders from various industries. Yet, amidst the whirlwind of activity, Amara's mind kept circling back to a bigger question. How could she sustain the momentum her keynote had generated? She wasn't just thinking about inspiring individuals anymore. She wanted to reshape systems, industries, policies, and mindsets on a scale that would ripple far beyond the summit. As she stared at the sunrise through her hotel suite window, she realized she was at a crossroads. Her legacy was no longer about personal success. It was about systemic transformation. The morning's first event was the roundtable discussion, held in an ornate conference room with high ceilings and a sprawling mahogany table. The attendees included CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, policymakers, and thought leaders. The agenda was clear. Identify actionable strategies to combat bias and foster equity in leadership. Amara was seated near the head of the table, her presence commanding even in a room filled with power players. As the discussion began, she noticed familiar patterns emerging, polished language that danced around the real issues, vague commitments, and a reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths. Before we go any further, Amara interjected, her tone cutting through the polite murmur of voices. I'd like to challenge this group to step out of the theoretical and into the practical. We've all acknowledged that bias exists. The question is, what are we actually willing to do about it? Her words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Some attendees shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, but others leaned in, intrigued. A woman named Priya, the CEO of a multinational tech firm, spoke up. You're right, Dr. Daniels. We need more than talk. My company has started reevaluating our hiring practices, but it's clear that's not enough. What do you propose? Amara's gaze swept the room. For starters, transparency. Publish your diversity metrics, not just for hiring, but for promotions, pay equity, and leadership representation. Let your employees and stakeholders hold you accountable. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, but one attendee, a senior executive from a major investment firm, raised an eyebrow. Isn't that a bit risky? He asked. What if the metrics show we're failing? Then it's an opportunity to improve. Amara replied without missing a beat. Leadership isn't about avoiding risk. It's about confronting challenges head-on. If you're not willing to own your shortcomings, how can you expect to grow? The discussion shifted into a more serious and productive tone, with attendees brainstorming concrete steps their organizations could take. By the time the roundtable ended, several companies had committed to publicizing their diversity data and implementing mentorship programs for underrepresented employees. After the roundtable, Amara was approached by Priya, who seemed genuinely impressed. You have a way of cutting through the noise, she said. Have you ever considered expanding your influence beyond the corporate world? Maybe public office? Amara laughed lightly. I've thought about it, she admitted. But for now, my focus is on driving change from where I stand. The corporate world is a powerful lever, and I want to pull it as far as it can go. Well, if you ever decide to make that leap, let me know, Priya said. We need more leaders like you, wherever you choose to lead. Amara thanked her and moved on, her mind swirling with possibilities. By midday, Amara found herself at a lunch meeting with representatives from the venture capital fund she had agreed to consult on. They were eager to move forward with her recommendations and had already drafted a preliminary plan for their new fund aimed at underrepresented entrepreneurs. This is a great start, Amara said as she reviewed the document. But I want to ensure the criteria for funding are inclusive. Let's focus not just on market potential, but also on the societal impact these businesses can have. And I'd like to see a commitment to ongoing mentorship for the founders you back. One of the representatives, a younger man named Liam, nodded enthusiastically. I love that idea, he said. We've been so focused on financial returns that we haven't considered how these ventures could drive broader change. Amara smiled. Financial returns are important, but so is building a better future. The two don't have to be mutually exclusive. As the afternoon wore on, Amara carved out time to revisit the summit floor, mingling with attendees and listening to their stories. One interaction stood out. A middle-aged man named Hector, who had recently started a nonprofit aimed at providing career training for formerly incarcerated individuals. "I've been hitting brick walls with funding," Hector admitted. "People see the word incarcerated, and they turn away before I can explain the potential." Amara felt a pang of recognition. Hector's struggle mirrored the countless times she had been dismissed or underestimated. "Don't give up," she said firmly. "The barriers you're facing are exactly why your work matters. Let's connect after the summit. I'd like to introduce you to some people who might be interested in supporting your mission." Hector's eyes widened in gratitude. "Thank you, Dr. Daniels. That means more than you know." By evening, Amara was back in her suite, the weight of the day settling over her like a heavy but satisfying cloak. The conversations, the commitments, the sparks of change, it was all a reminder of the responsibility she carried. Her phone buzzed with a notification, an email from a journalist requesting a follow-up interview about her keynote. The subject line read, "What's next for Dr. Amara Daniels?" Amara stared at the screen for a moment before typing a quick reply. Subject: What's next for Dr. Amara Daniels? Thank you for reaching out. I'd be happy to discuss the next steps. For me, the journey isn't about what's next. It's about what's lasting. Let's schedule a time to talk. Best regards, Amara. She set the phone down and leaned back, letting her gaze drift out over the city. The crossroads she had faced earlier now felt less daunting. Her path was clear. She wouldn't just inspire change. She would build the structures to sustain it. Tomorrow was another day, another opportunity to push the boundaries further. But for tonight, Amara allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction, knowing the ripple effect she had started was growing stronger with every passing hour. Building bridges, breaking chains. The last day of the summit dawned bright and clear, with the sun casting long shadows over the bustling city below. Dr. Amara Daniels sat in the lounge of her suite, her laptop open, as she reviewed notes for her final panel discussion. Today wasn't just about concluding her participation. It was about planting the seeds for what came next. As her assistant Lori handed her a fresh cup of coffee, she couldn't help but notice the intensity in Amara's expression. "You've been quieter than usual this morning," Lori remarked. "What's on your mind?" Amara leaned back, her gaze distant. "I'm thinking about bridges," she said. "Bridges?" Lori asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," Amara replied, her voice thoughtful. "We spend so much time breaking barriers, but what happens after they're broken? You can't just leave the pieces scattered on the ground. You need to build bridges to connect people, ideas, and opportunities. That's what today is about." Lori nodded, her admiration for Amara deepening. "Well," she said with a smile, "you're the best bridge builder I know." The final panel was titled, "Transformative Leadership: The Road Ahead." Amara was joined by an eclectic mix of speakers, a tech visionary, a civil rights advocate, and an economist specializing in equitable development. The ballroom was packed, every seat taken, with attendees even standing along the walls. The moderator began with a question directed at Amara. "Dr. Daniels, your keynote sparked widespread conversations about bias and leadership. What do you believe is the next step for organizations that want to turn awareness into action?" Amara leaned forward, her voice steady and clear. "The next step is accountability," she said. "Awareness is only the beginning. Organizations need to embed equity into their DNA. That means policies, training, mentorship, and most importantly, transparency. Change happens when leaders are willing to hold themselves and their teams accountable, not just for what they achieve, but for how they achieve it." The tech visionary, a young entrepreneur named Kieran, chimed in. I agree with Dr. Daniels, he said. In tech, we talk a lot about disruption, but we rarely disrupt the systems of inequity within our own companies. It's time to change that. The civil rights advocate, a seasoned activist named Ruth, nodded. What both of you are saying resonates deeply, she said. But let's not forget that change also requires courage. It's easy to talk about equity in a boardroom. It's harder to fight for it when it challenges deeply entrenched power structures. Amara listened intently, then added, courage is essential, but so is collaboration. None of us can do this alone. That's why building bridges is so important. We need to connect across industries, sectors, and perspectives to create a unified front for change. The discussion continued for over an hour, with each speaker contributing unique insights. By the end, the audience erupted into applause, a standing ovation that underscored the panel's impact. As the crowd dispersed, several attendees approached Amara to express their gratitude and share their own ideas. One young woman, an aspiring activist named Layla, spoke passionately about her desire to start a community program for marginalized youth. I've always wanted to create a space where kids can learn skills and see possibilities beyond their circumstances, Layla said. But I don't know where to start. Amara smiled warmly. Start small, she advised. Find one space, one group of kids, and one skill you can teach. Let it grow organically. And remember, it's okay to ask for help. Building a network of support is one of the most powerful things you can do. Layla nodded, her determination evident. Thank you, Dr. Daniels. I needed to hear that. By late afternoon, the summit officially concluded, but for Amara, the work was far from over. She had scheduled a private meeting with several key attendees who had expressed interest in forming a coalition focused on systemic change. The group included executives, activists, and educators, each bringing a unique perspective to the table. We've all seen the power of individual action, Amara began, addressing the group. But if we want to create lasting change, we need to work together. This coalition isn't just about talking. It's about doing. We'll identify specific projects, set measurable goals, and hold ourselves accountable. The group spent hours brainstorming ideas, from creating leadership development programs for underserved communities to advocating for policy changes that promote workplace equity. By the end of the meeting, they had outlined the framework for their coalition and agreed to meet monthly to track progress. That evening, Amara returned to her suite, physically tired but mentally energized. She stepped out onto the balcony, the city lights twinkling like stars. The summit had been a success, but it was only the beginning. The conversation she had sparked, the connection she had forged, and the commitments she had inspired were all pieces of a much larger puzzle. Her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an article titled, "The Summit That Shifted the Paradigm. Dr. Amara Daniels Leads the Way." She skimmed the piece, which praised her keynote and the initiatives that had emerged in its wake. But what caught her attention was a quote from an anonymous attendee. Dr. Daniels didn't just make me think, she made me act. And that's the kind of leadership the world needs. Amara set her phone down, her chest swelling with a mix of pride and humility. Leadership wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. It was about building bridges, breaking chains, and inspiring others to do the same. As the city hummed below her, Amara made a silent promise. She would keep pushing, keep building, and keep fighting for a world where no one was underestimated or excluded because of their identity. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready to walk it. And she wouldn't be walking alone.